honestly, people want to know the truth. You know, I think this false narrative that the truth scares people. No, and race is always going to be very delicate to talk about. But when you have a story that is so inspirational and so uplifting like this story, race in some ways becomes secondary. Because this is the power of the human spirit to persevere and prevail. And in general, we love stories like this. And the thing that is so beautiful about the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is, number one, you don't have to be a baseball fan to love the museum. Now, of course, we think it's sacrilegious if you're not, but you don't have to be a baseball fan, because if you are a fan of American history, you're going to love the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. If you are a fan of the underdog overcoming adversity to go on to greatness, you're going to love the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Now, if you are a baseball fan to boot, well, as we say in the country where I'm from in Georgia, then you're in hog heaven, because it combines the best of all of those worlds.
Hello and welcome back to the Lee Summit Town Hall podcast. I'm your host, Nick Parker. This is a good time to remind everybody that this podcast is brought to the good people by Budget Blinds of Lee Summit, a great local store run by a great local family. They are your home for enlightened style shades. It's also, I'm going to look over at my guest at this one because he probably doesn't know. It's your home for the smart stuff. You want to tell your phone to raise your blinds? You can do that. You can do that with stuff from Budget Blinds. We like to call them our robot shade overlords.
I love how you have that spiel down. That's great.
I do. I really do. It's been a few years. They have been longtime supporters of Link to Lee Summit, of this podcast, the Lee Summit Town Hall podcast, and great supporters of really so many things around the company. So when you're ready to make your home a smart home, go see our friends at Budget Blinds. Tell them Nick sent you. My guest today, this is bucket list item for me. I have dreamed of this for years. My guest today, Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. You host of the Black Diamonds podcast. I'm already nervous. I'm stumbling over myself.
Don't be.
I've been wanting this for a long time. This is gonna be a little bit different of an episode for what we usually do here. But welcome to the show, Bob. I appreciate it.
It's an honor. Thanks so much for having me.
I am a baseball dork. I love anything about baseball, and I love this gem of the city, that I call home, Kansas City. This is just a great thing, and I really admire, as somebody who stumbled into podcasting about 10 years ago. Newspaper is my background, but podcasting and telling stories verbally is a whole new thing for me. Even though it's been 10 years, I still think it's new. And I am just an admirer of what you do. And you have spent decades now telling untold stories.
Yes.
And not just spreading the word of baseball, but spreading the word of the Negro Leagues and that history, that piece of baseball that maybe we all didn't know about.
Yeah. Well, and it's really interesting to hear you say that, Nick, because I started in the newspaper business as well.
I knew there was something righteous about you.
I worked for 10 years at the Kansas City Star. And when I got out of college, I went to Park College, now Park University, and I earned a bachelor's degree in communication arts with an emphasis in broadcast communication and journalism. And so my first job right out of college was at the Kansas City Star, and I was working in the composing room, putting the newspaper together as I was trying to figure out which direction I wanted to go. I didn't know if I wanted to go into print media, if I wanted to go into broadcast or not. And so my first job was there at the Kansas City Star, working in the composing room. I ultimately gravitated to the Star's promotions department, which functioned as its in-house advertising agency. And that is how I ultimately got connected to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And this was in 1993. I graduated in 1985. 1993, my former colleague, Darrell Durham, who was my boss, came by my desk and said, I think I got something that you might enjoy. We're going to give some print space to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum so that they can promote a new exhibition called Discover Greatness. That exhibition is still touring the country 33 years later.
Wow.
And to be honest, I didn't even know there was a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and it was literally right down the street from where the Kansas City Star operated at that time. And so that was my introduction to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But like you, I started in the newspaper business. I stumbled into the world of podcasting with my podcast called Black Diamonds that I do with my friends over at Sirius XM Radio, and it has drawn a lot of acclaim. I'm very fortunate, and I was totally resistant to doing this whole podcasting thing. And the folks at Sirius stayed on me, said, we would love to give you a platform. And I kept saying, guys, I don't have time to do this. And they said, we'll send you the equipment, we'll get you a producer, we'll do all the work. You just get on and tell stories. And at some point, you realize, Bob, you got to do this. This is a national, international platform for this museum, so you got to carve out some time. And so we would actually do the show from my office more times than not. And
Isn't that the great thing about podcasting?
That's the thing about podcasting.
I do another show with a partner of mine, Nigel, called Beers with Nigel, and we talk about the craft beer industry and talk to a lot of black-owned breweries and things around the country. And originally, when we started it, in January of 2020, we thought we were just going to be in Kansas City. And then the world ended, and we realized there aren't limits. Yeah. And so we've had guests from around the world and told stories that way forever. And I think that's one of the great things about what podcasting has done, is that we really, really can just talk to or from anywhere.
Well, that's the beauty of that digital platform, because you can be virtually anywhere. And so the podcast has had a lot of success, and we've now archived over 100 episodes, over 5 seasons of doing the podcast. And it really has opened up Negro Leagues history to a lot of people. I had to also be mindful of the fact that there was another generation of baseball fans who didn't see Buck O'Neil when he was telling these wonderful stories in Ken Burns' epic documentary on the history of baseball, which is when Buck exploded on the scene.
For sure.
Yeah, just literally exploded on the scene.
I think I'd heard the name.
Uh-huh. And same thing with me. I'd heard the name, but I had never had the opportunity to meet him. And Buck would say, Bob, I've been telling these stories for 40 years, and no one ever listened. And then Ken Burns came along, gave him a platform, and people started listening, and they never stopped listening. And the good Lord blessed him to live another 12 years. Because when he made his debut in baseball, as I like to describe it, you had this very charming, gentle man who was telling these wonderful baseball stories to baseball fans primarily. And they'd never heard these stories. Mm-hmm. And he did it with a twinkle in his eye and a smile that lit up the screen, and America fell in love with Buck. And I'll never forget the headline in the Kansas City Star after his first appearance said, "A star is born at 82. Yeah, and the good Lord did bless him to live another 12 years where he was literally gallivanting across this country, as I like to say, preaching the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of his museum to any and everyone who would listen.
It really is amazing. And I often think of the cliched line from Moneyball, how can you not be romantic about baseball? Yeah. That line speaks so much just to the story of Buck O'Neil, to me. I mean,
no question.
It is a story of, stories of baseball, but it's a story of love and passion.
Oh, it is. And it speaks to the story of the Negro Leagues. And Buck, of course, you cannot separate the two. And he really is the principal voice that helped us learn about the history of the Negro Leagues. Now, there were a lot of other people who had been telling these stories, but like I said, Sirius XM Radio gave me a platform. Ken Burns gave Buck a platform at a time when his museum was just in a fledgling state. It needed that voice. And he became the inspirational leader, and he served in his role as chairman of the board for 16 years. He's the founder of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum when it was established in a little one-room office about as big as his studio in 1990. And he and other local Negro Leaguers literally, Nick, took turns paying the monthly rent to keep the little office open. And that's how we got started. We are as grassroots an institution as you will ever encounter. No one gave this museum any chance of succeeding, and particularly because we were building a museum there at historic 18th and Vine, which in its heyday was as recognized street cross-section as there was anywhere in the world. It was thriving. It was jumping. But like a lot of urban areas, it had died and had, in essence, been abandoned. And here comes this fledgling Negro Leagues Baseball Museum saying, we're going to build a museum here, and not only are we going to build this museum, we're going to resurrect historic 18th and Vine. That was in 1990. We hadn't looked back since. No, people are living, working, and playing again at 18th and Vine, and the prospect for, I think, an even more dynamic 18th and Vine is still yet to come, which we're excited to be playing a role in that as well.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it, I didn't intend to go this direction, but I mean, if you look at what's happening now, it's just, don't you feel like it's really on the cusp of something?
I do.
I mean, with, Vine Street Brewing moves in, and there's all this development that's happening around there as well, that just you feel like you're on the cusp of something.
We are, and of course, our plans to build a brand new 30+ thousand Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, 30+ thousand square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as part of an exciting and dynamic Negro Leagues campus that we're creating, which includes the historic Paseo YMCA. Mm-hmm. And for those who may not be aware, it was in that building that the Negro Leagues were established in 1920, February 13th, 1920. A guy by the name of Andrew Rube Foster would lead a contingent of 8 independent black baseball team owners into a meeting at the Paseo YMCA, and out of that meeting came the birth of the Negro National League, the first successful organized black baseball league. That building, too, had been abandoned for years. It was last in operations in the mid-1970s, about 1974, and it had been abandoned, boarded up, and we took ownership of that building, been steadily working to renovate it, restore it. It is going to be the Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center. The new museum will be built adjacent to that historic landmark. And then we just recently announced plans for there to be a Marriott tribute hotel called the Pennant that will be built into the new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
How is that? And we're going to get back to the stories and stuff in a second, but how is it now to look and think that it's finally becoming that destination that you dreamed of and Buck dreamed of for years?
No, that you're absolutely right. And for me, I take great pride. It's an honor to have essentially been passed the baton from Buck. And you can't fill his shoes. You'd be naive to think that you could ever fill Buck O'Neill's shoes because you can't. But for me, it's an honor to walk in his footsteps and to carry on what he had started. He gave the last 16 years of his life to build this museum, to raise awareness, to raise money for it, and now to be able to continue what he had invested so much in, and not just him, but others as well. But he was the principal voice. And so it's exciting. And we think that, and you touched on it, we think we've just scratched the surface in terms of what historic 18th and Vine can and will be. And I'm just excited that the spirit of the Negro Leagues is driving that. Because when you dive into the story of the Negro Leagues in a deeper capacity, when we start to look beyond the playing field, you'll learn that wherever you had successful black baseball, you typically had thriving black economies. And so when we lost the Negro Leagues, we lost that catalyst that sparked economic development in so many urban areas. So Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier was monumental in terms of sparking integration, not only in baseball, but in a broader spectrum. But the byproduct of that integration was the demise of the Negro Leagues, which led to the demise of black economy in so many urban cities across this country.
That correlation is really, really, I think, surprising to people.
It is, and it's surprising. It is so incredibly interesting, those dynamics, because what was good on one hand morally, socially, but it was devastating economically. And as I always tell my guests, there is always a cost for progress.
Mm-hmm.
Always. Always a cost. Today it is more technological in nature, but with each technological advancement, what happens? Somebody loses their job.
Right.
But as I remind my guests, this was good for the soul of our country. It moved us in ways socially we never dreamt possible, but it absolutely came at a price to those black businesses who really never recovered from losing the Negro Leagues.
But now the circle kind of, the long game. I want to go back to 1993, which I'm going to tell you, I'm sorry, I was graduating high school that year. No idea what I was going to do after that. I want to talk a little bit about that. What drew you in? You obviously ended up with this amazing opportunity and relationship with Buck O'Neil. But what was it that drew you to? You have the marketing background,
Mm-hmm.
so you know what you're looking for a little bit. But what was it that really drew you in that said, I want to tell these stories?
It really happened by happenstance, because when I went down to find this fledgling Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and I go up to the third floor of the Lincoln Building, which was the only functioning building there at historic 18th and Vine at that time, and I'm looking for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And I peeped my head in this room, and the late Don Motley, who was then the executive director of the museum, was sitting behind his desk, and I say, I'm looking for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he looks up at me and he smiles. He says, son, you're standing in it. It was just this one-room office, but as I oftentimes share, particularly when I speak to my school-age audiences, when I walked into that one-room office, I didn't know it at the time, but I had literally just walked into what would become my passion. I just fell in love with this story, and I fell in love even more so with the amazing athletes who made this story. And honestly, Nick, it was their spirits that grabbed hold of you. They had such incredibly endearing spirits, because had they been bitter about the things that transpired in their lives as they were trying to play baseball in this country, we all would have said, you had every right to be bitter. But to a player that I ever met, not one of them harbored any bitterness or expressed any ill will toward anyone who may have attempted to perpetrate something against them. And I just found this incredibly refreshing, incredibly endearing. And when you're around people like that, I think there's a spillover effect, because we live in such a cynical world, particularly today.
Right.
And here these incredibly courageous athletes, when you talk to them, and I understand why people wanted to focus on the hardships. The hardships were real, but they wanted to tell you about the joy that they had playing baseball. I made my living playing baseball. And it took me a little while to understand, how could this be? How could you not be bitter? Well, first and foremost, they were never going to be bitter about baseball, because you could not convince them that they weren't playing the best baseball. Now, most believe that the best baseball was being played in the major leagues. But you see, they never believed that. They knew how good they were. They knew how good their league was. And quite frankly, the major leaguers knew how good they were, because they played countless exhibition games against one another. And the record books bear out that the Negro Leagues teams, or the Black All-Star teams, won the majority of those head-to-head matchups. So no, they weren't going to be bitter about baseball. Did they like the things that were happening as they were going around this country, traveling the highways and byways of this country to play? No, of course not. If you could imagine this, they could ride into a town, fill up the ballpark, but then not be able to get something to eat from the same fans who had just cheered them, or not have a place to stay so they would indeed sleep on the bus and eat their peanut butter and crackers until they could get to a place that would offer them basic services. But as I oftentimes share, and again, when I speak to school-age audience, this is the thing that makes the Negro Leagues so special. Their spirits were such that, okay, if I've got to sleep on the bus, and if I've got to eat my peanut butter and crackers, I'm going to keep playing ball. You can't rob me of this joy of playing baseball, and I'm good at it, and I want everyone to know how good I am at it. And so, as I remind folks, our story is not a woe is mine. It's not a woe is me. No. They never cried about the social injustice. They went out and did something about it. You won't let me play with you in the major leagues, then I will create a league of my own. And folks, what an incredible league it was. It would produce some of the greatest athletes to ever put on a baseball uniform, and they were filling up ballparks all over the country, including outdrawing many major league teams in their own stadiums.
Crazy to think about. Do you think that, you talk about the spirit, the story of the spirit. Do you think that's what allows you a little bit, because, and we'll talk about this too, but, I feel like the last 5 years has really been a boom in attention and awareness of the mission of the museum and what you're doing. But do you think that story is kind of those stories of spirit? What lets you stay above the fray a little bit? Because in today's society, right, there's so much negative.
Oh my goodness.
And I would think, look, I am who I look like I am, right? I would think that it would be hard to purposefully tell stories when you're talking about race all the time in this country today. But do you get away with it because of the story of human spirit? Is that what it is?
That's what it is. And honestly, people want to know the truth. There's this false narrative that the truth scares people. No, and race is always going to be very delicate to talk about. But when you have a story that is so inspirational and so uplifting like this story, race in some ways becomes secondary, because this is the power of the human spirit to persevere and prevail. And in general, we love stories like this. And the thing that is so beautiful about the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is, number one, you don't have to be a baseball fan to love the museum. Now, of course, we think it's sacrilegious if you're not, but you don't have to be a baseball fan, because if you are a fan of American history, you're going to love the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. If you are a fan of the underdog overcoming adversity to go on to greatness, you're going to love the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Now, if you are a baseball fan to boot, well, as we say in the country where I'm from in Georgia, then you're in hog heaven, because it combines the best of all of those worlds. And as I tell my guests, the story of the Negro Leagues is America at its worst, because segregation was a horrible chapter in this country's history. But it's also America at its finest, because out of segregation emerged this wonderful story of triumph and conquest. Yeah, and again, it's all based on that one small, simple principle. You won't let me play with you, I create my own, which is the American way. And so even though America was trying to prevent them from sharing in the joys of its so-called national pastime, it was the American spirit that allowed them to persevere and prevail. And every person that walks through this museum, and I was no different when I encountered it for the first time, it was an awakening, because you are amazed by what you learn, but to be honest, you leave a little bit dismayed by the fact that I just now had an opportunity to learn it. You question, why didn't I know this during my own formal education? And the answer is simple. American historians did us all a tremendous disservice. They kept this chapter of baseball and Americana away from us. So the moral majority of us went through our own formal education without knowing one of the most significant chapters, again, not in baseball history, but an American history. And that's what comes across when you go through that museum. And this country's greatness is really built around the diversity that has been a part of these stories. But unfortunately, many of those stories have never reached mainstream. And that's been the constant quest for us to give this history a mainstream voice. And we've just seen so many people respond so beautifully. But what I admire about our young people, and you touched on something earlier about the meteoric rise of podcasting.
Yeah.
I think there's a reason for that. Because our children, what they identify with, authenticity and storytelling. And the Negro League brings you both of those.
All of those things. I love that you talked about what the real American story is, and that's, really, we love the contrarian attitude, right?
We do.
We're all teenagers at heart, basically. Tell me no, and I'm going to do it anyway and prove otherwise, right?
That's it. That's it.
You've Buck told all these amazing stories. You've continued, and you still. Are you still looking is there a part of you that's still digging around and finding new stories? And what are you looking for as you do that?
All the time, because I'm still learning. And I've been affiliated with this museum, it's hard to believe now, for 33 years. Again, starting as a volunteer, and then in 2011, becoming president of this same organization. And it's an incredible story in its own right. I never saw that coming. When I got involved with the museum, I just wanted to support it in any way that I could. I wanted to be on Buck's team and help any way that I could.
Who doesn't want to be on Buck's team?
Exactly. And I never dreamed that it would become a career. And to be honest, one of the most gratifying, rewarding things I think I could have done either personally or professionally. I just stumbled into this. And as fate would have it, it turned into a wonderful opportunity for me. I have been tremendously blessed to do something that I absolutely, positively love doing. And Buck once said something to me. He said, if you find a job that you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And he was absolutely right. And again, when I talk to particularly my high school students, that's what we talk about. Identifying your passion. And if you're fortunate enough to identify that passion and then be able to follow that passion, it is so gratifying. It is so tremendously fulfilling. And I think any time that you do something that you know is bigger than you are, there's no greater reward. And if we do it right, we will leave a legacy. We will leave something that will stand the test of time, that generations to come will have an opportunity to not only come there and learn, but be inspired by these courageous athletes who, when it's all said and done, man, they just wanted to play ball. That's all. They just wanted to play ball.
How many of us, that's what we wanted as kids?
That's it. Just wanted to play.
That relatability, is that the key?
I think it is.
Is that we can all relate to,
yes,
I just want to play ball.
Yeah, and
or whatever that passion is.
Those kinds of triumphant stories seem to resonate in our society. And the great characters of the Negro Leagues, they're almost mythical-like in nature. We try our best to try and humanize them, but many of them are larger than life. When you start to talk about the likes of a Leroy Satchel Paige or a cool Papa Bell, the mythical-like power of a Josh Gibson. But there were so many other stars that people are getting an opportunity to learn about. But then the other nuances that are such a pertinent part of the story. Our story is about the importance of economic empowerment. It is a story about an unprecedented level of leadership that emerged in many African-American communities across this country. And then ultimately, it is the story of the socialization of America, or the social advancement of America, as Jackie Robinson is handpicked from the great Kansas City Monarchs to become the chosen one. And that still surprises so many of my guests, because I think that they think that Jackie just walked out of nowhere and started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. But, folks, his real rookie season was right here in Kansas City for the great Kansas City Monarchs in 1945. Now, he was only here for 5 months. But as I remind folks, the 5 months he spent in Kansas City, he fell in love with everything that Kansas City is famous for, barbecue and jazz. He liked the ribs at a place called Old Kentuck Barbecue. Now, for you barbecue aficionados, Old Kentuck Barbecue was the forerunner of the great Gates barbecue chain of restaurants that are still world-renowned here in Kansas City to this day. And I'm going to say that he fell deeper in love with jazz. But while New Orleans may lay claim to jazz, Kansas City gave jazz its soul. And 5 months later, he was gone. He had literally disappeared. And I've been so blessed to have known several of his 1945 Monarch teammates. Sadly, they've all passed on now. But if they were with us, they'd tell you that when Jackie joined the Monarchs, there was no fanfare surrounding him. Nicky was just another ball player trying to make the great Kansas City Monarchs roster, but they all knew that he was different than they were. And Buck O'Neil would surmise it in this fashion. He would say that we had become acclimated to segregation, but not Jackie, because Jackie was Pasadena, California. He's UCLA. So this whole Jim Crow stuff didn't sit well with him whatsoever. But beyond that, that was it. And 5 months later, he was gone. He had literally disappeared. His teammates had no idea where he was. Of course, we now know that he was meeting with Branch Rickey, where the two of them would make the monumental decision that he would become the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's then 6-decade-long self-imposed color barrier. Well, at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we make the rather bold assertion that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement, it was the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, how did you get there? How did you make that link?
Yeah, because this is before those more noted civil rights occurrences. So this is before Brown versus the Board of Education. Right. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as old Buck would so eloquently say, was merely a sophomore at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, when Jackie signed his contract to play in the Dodgers organization. And, of course, as you know, our very own President Harry S. Truman, born right up the road from where the museum operates, Independence, Missouri, would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackie. So for all intents and purposes, this is what started the ball of social progress rolling in our country, baseball. And our country literally jumped on the coattail of baseball because baseball was our national pastime. And it set the stage and the tenor. So even though Major League Baseball had been vilified for not allowing blacks to play, when it opened its door, our country followed suit. It speaks to the reverence that baseball held, and I still think to a large degree still holds in our society.
How much responsibility do you feel? I mean, look, you've talked about a lot of things here, and you know, we start off, you're just talking baseball, which, right, is going to get all of us in. But I mean, even you just said recently, too, that it's a story of economics.
Yes.
And it's a story of the start of a civil rights movement in a country. What kind of responsibility do you feel that you're not just spreading the stories of the Negro Leagues themselves and their space here, but it links to so many other aspects of Americana?
Yeah. No, it's a tremendous responsibility, but it's also a wonderful opportunity for us to educate. You know, that's what we see the museum as, a tremendous educational resource. And these other aspects that you and I have been talking about, these are surprising to a lot of people because we naturally gravitate to the ball players. And we do fall in love with the spirit that they demonstrated. You know, the willingness to go against whatever obstacles to play the game that you love. Baseball at its crux is the most romanticized sport of them all. Yeah,
for good reason.
Yeah, it really is, because I'm a fan of all the other sports. Played college basketball, but there's nothing quite like baseball. People measure periods in their lives by baseball. Yeah, and what you hear more times than not, people talk about who took me to my first baseball game. You rarely ever hear somebody talk. Somebody took me. My daddy took me to my first football game or my first basketball game, but my grandfather took me to my first baseball game, or my daddy played catch with me. You just hold on to that. You relish those moments. And that's why I think the spirit of the Negro Leagues is so appealing to so many people, but it's so layered. It is so multifaceted. And as I say, it is a fascinatingly complicated story. Yeah, which is why I'm pitching right now for there to be a dramatic TV series done on the Negro Leagues. I hope that's the next major venture for us.
That would be fantastic.
Would be to take this and create an episodic TV series based on the history of the Negro Leagues.
How important is it for others to find these kind of stories? To find, maybe it's not baseball, but to find these stories of not just the untold stories, and we are at the end here of Black History Month.
Yeah,
and to talk about and celebrate the Black stories of our society, but to find these things that are great stories and great characters, but they overlap and tell us so much more about the communities and the places we live. How important is that?
I think it's extremely important. That's why I think cultural institutions like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum are so vitally important, because they bridge the gap. You see, you won't find these stories in the pages of American history books. And so I don't think there was ever a time that we didn't want to know about the Negro Leagues. We just simply had no way to know about the Negro Leagues. And a museum like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum brings that story to the forefront. Yeah, now it is alive. And that's why people, I think, have gravitated to this story. And it's such a inspirational story. Yeah, and so I think we have to find ways to share these stories. And in the process, I do think we established an even greater level of commonality, because oftentimes the focus is on our differences. And that's okay. We shouldn't run from our differences. Our differences are the things that make us unique as human beings. But a story like the Negro Leagues helps us identify the fact that we have far more in common than we do differences. And I think that's where these cultural institutions come into play. And they're so needed and so vitally important because, again, they are filling in the gaps in the pages of American history books. We want the complete story of America to be told and shared because there are a lot of folks who have contributed to the greatness of this country.
We've talked a lot about podcasting and doing that, something that we have in common. You've said you dream for a new TV show, which I don't know how I can ever influence that, but man, let's make that happen. As you look at the way you're collecting and telling stories, what are you looking at as all the ways that we can, to attract and bring in new audiences, retain those audiences, so that the stories keep getting told? Yeah,
because I'm concerned about those stories being told. Like I said, I'm so blessed. I was with Buck. As he was gallivanting across this country and preaching the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of his museum, I guess you could say I was a disciple of his. I'm hanging from the garment, by the hem of his garment, and now I get to preach the gospel of the Negro Leagues and the virtues of Buck's museum to any and everyone who listens. I don't ever want these stories to die. And so we needed to make sure that we have a repository of these stories. And I think that's where the podcast, Black Diamonds, like I said, 100 episodes of those stories that most people had never heard before. And that led to the partnership that we now have with my friends over at Sony and at San Diego Studios for the inclusion of the Negro Leagues into the video game MLB The Show. And Nick, it may be the biggest thing our museum has ever done. And who knew that it would be a video game of all things? Because it has now opened Negro Leagues history up to a generation of young folks and young adults who I'm not sure would have ever thought about the Negro Leagues until we put them in the video game a mode and medium in which they were accustomed to engaging with. And what warms my heart is that not only are they learning about the Negro Leagues, man, they've fallen in love with these players from the Negro Leagues and the stories behind them. And it has made me a household name in the gaming community because I'm in the video game telling stories. And sometimes you have to go where they are. I think any museum, but particularly a history museum, and even more so a cultural institution like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we have to make history relevant. We have to make it meaningful for young people. Because I think there's a misnomer around our children that they don't care about history. No, they care, but it's also incumbent upon how history is presented. It can't always be just for history's sake as it's seen in a textbook. And again, when we put these legendary ball players into the video game, now they're engaging with them. And I've always believed that experiential learning was the most significant way for any of us to learn. We retain that. And I understand the pressures that are on our educators to teach to standardized testing standards. They have to pass these tests. Funding is associated with the ability to get all these kids to pass these tests. But I'll be honest, I hopefully will do enough to pass that test. And once I walk away from it, it is forgotten. But if you give me an experience, I'm going to retain that. I'm going to remember that. There's a reason that we still remember the lyrics of songs 25, 30 years after we've heard them. And what I am so pleased is that since we put the Negro Leagues into the video game, we've won a number of educational awards for how we're using a video game to teach history. Because even video games have gotten its bad rap because of some of the violence that are associated with the game. But we did something completely unique. And I have to tip my cap to my friends over at San Diego Studios because, number one, they put their heart and soul into this. When I went for the reveal the very first year, 2023, when we did the first release of this game, we were all standing there in awe, and we're all emotional seeing what they had done because folks, when you see this video game, and video gaming has changed a whole lot from the time that I was playing an Atari, the uniforms, you can almost feel the wool in those old uniforms. And they took the old stadiums and added them to the game. And everybody's in the stands dressed up the way that they used to go to Negro League games because there was nothing recreational about a Negro Leagues game. It was the social event of the week. And all of this is captured. And you could tell, I'm sure those young game developers are always very proud of the work they do, but you got a feeling that this hit a little different. And we're all standing there. We're all teary-eyed. And I just take great pride in every day somebody walks into that museum because they saw the museum in the video game and they want to meet the guy that's telling the stories in the video game. Me. Awesome. And so Sony was very smart. They didn't just throw these players in the game randomly with no context behind them. They created a mode called storylines. And so you get introduced to the player, but we almost force you to learn their backstory before you can actually utilize the player in the game. And that's where I come in. So you get these short vignettes, so they're not so long that the kids get bored with them. These short vignettes, they put a killer soundtrack behind it, and I guess a guy that tells a decent story, and voila, you've got them. And kids come into the museum, they want to show me how Satchel Paige did his double pump wind up. They want to do the high leg kick like Satchel, and they all want to throw the b-ball like Satchel threw the b-ball. And man, it just touches my heart because that's exactly what we hope would happen. And honestly, Nick, I think I was a little bit naive. I knew we were doing something special, but I don't think I really understood just how big the gaming platform really is.
my son, who does not like baseball, and he's a freshman in college now, but he finally admitted that the reason was because his mom and dad liked baseball. But I will tell you, that part of the game got him there. It got him there because he loves stories. He loves stories.
Yeah.
And he loves history.
Yeah.
And those little vignettes got him. I mean,
I
couldn't do it as dad, but that game got him.
Yeah, no, it fills me with great joy, man, because I get people who call me. They want to thank me for what we've done. Because I think there were a lot of people who had hoped that the Negro Leagues would one day be in the video game, but these were the real baseball enthusiasts.
Right.
They are knowledgeable of the history of the game. But what we've done has been incredibly special. This started in 23. We have a 5-year partnership. The new game comes out next month, and we'll ultimately have 10 players added to the game. And so new stories. So I was out in San Diego a few months ago where we were recording new content for the video game, and it's just been amazing. I think if anyone deserved to be in a video game, it would have been the players from the Negro Leagues. They played the game, I guess you could say, video game-esque.
Yeah.
Again, the speed of Cool Papa Bell, the power of Josh Gibson, the swagger of Satchel Paige, calling in the outfield, sitting the infield down as he would proceed to strike out the side. And the kids can relate to that. They relate to that swagger. And so it's been amazing to see the reaction that they got. I knew they loved these players, but I've been pleasantly surprised at how much they love the story. They can't get enough of the stories, but it goes back to what we said initially. Authenticity and storytelling.
As we wrap up, because I want to be respectful of your time, but one other thing, another side of that I've always been impressed with, and I think especially with your Black Diamonds podcast, is hearing that podcast, but then also reading the stories of how often other teams come visit. And one of the first things the players do as soon as they get an off day is they come for a tour. How big a deal is that? I mean, I love it because I'm romantic about baseball. I admit that. My bias is already there. But how big a deal is it that you're getting such interaction and buy-in from the players of today?
It means a great deal. And what I'm so pleased about is it went from me trying to convince them to come and experience the museum to now they are calling, wanting to come and experience the museum because the word has started to spread amongst their peers. You come to Kansas City, you call Bob, and you go down and take a tour of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And no sport holds to its history quite like baseball does. And if you're going to play this game, you should know the history of this game. And the history of the Negro Leagues is a very important part of the history of this game and the history of this country. And what I typically share with my young major league athletes, and really any of my student athletes who come to visit the museum, what you share, what you have in common with those who played in the Negro Leagues is real simple. Love of the game. You play this game because you love it. But you'll never see a greater example of love of the game than you do when you walk through that museum. So every time I get a young major leaguer in particular, it's always exciting. This never gets old for me. I love
awesome.
telling these stories. And perhaps it was because I was around Buck for so long. And I don't care how many times Buck may have told a story. But if he was telling it to you, he was going to tell it to you like it was the first time he ever told that story. He wasn't going to cheat you. And I feel that same level of responsibility. So I run my mouth all the time telling these stories, but I also love seeing their reaction to the story. And so last baseball season, when the Cardinals were in town,
I try not to mention that team on the show.
Jordan Walker and Victor Scott came over to see me. And this gives you an indication of the impact of this video game, because the first thing they asked me was, man, who is this dude, John Donaldson? Because apparently in the video game, nobody can hit him. John Donaldson, folks, was a great left-handed pitcher out of mid-Missouri, Glasgow, Missouri. And he is one of the greatest pitchers that probably no one has ever heard of, because he played in the early era of black baseball, prior to the formation of the Negro Leagues. And so those players don't get a lot of love, because the Buck O'Neills and the Monty Irvins and those folks, they told us about their contemporaries. So those early 1900 ball players, they don't get a lot of love. John Donaldson was idolized by Satchel Paige, which should tell you how great John Donaldson was. He was a left-handed pitcher who is credited with having invented the slider. And apparently in the video game, he throws that slider 95, 96 miles an hour, and nobody can touch him.
So we have him to blame. All of us who about, 13 to 15, when we realize we can't hit that pitch, we're blaming him.
Absolutely.
A couple of final things here. This one, you heard me stumble in the beginning saying this was a bucket list interview for me. I'm so appreciative. What's a story you haven't told that you want to tell? Who's somebody that you want to have on your show, or just get with? What's a story out there you're still chasing?
Well, there are so many of those stories, and that's why I keep pitching this idea about a dramatic TV series. And even though we've talked about Rube Foster, and Rube Foster is in the video game, his life is set up for a dramatic TV series, because he was the most brilliant mind in baseball history, I think. And he was the rarest of baseball figures who would have gone in the Hall of Fame as a player, as a manager, and as an executive. And as you know, you don't find many, if any, that check all three boxes. He was a great baseball pitcher himself in the early era of black baseball. He is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball. Back then it was called a fadeaway. He perfected this pitch, so much so that the great major league manager John McGraw snuck Rube into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Mathewson how to throw the screwball. Well, Christy Mathewson threw it all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from Rube Foster. But Foster was best known as this visionary, tremendous leader. As I mentioned, he organized the Negro Leagues. He would become president of his newly formed Negro National League. He owned the Chicago American Giants, and he managed the Chicago American Giants. And as a manager, so tremendously savvy, to the point that he was known to fine his ball players at the turn of the 1900s, folks, as much as $5 if you were tagged out standing up. Oh, no, you were supposed to slide. Rube would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line, and if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside the circle, he would fine them. He was adamant about the style of play that would become Negro Leagues baseball. Fast, aggressive, daring. So these guys would bunt their way on. They steal second. They'd steal third. And if you weren't too smart, they were still home. So he revolutionized his game. But Rube Foster, when he started the Negro Leagues, had either booking rights or ownership of 4 of the original 8 Negro League franchises. So what he does is he cuts a deal with the other Negro League owners. He divests ownership of 3, kept the Chicago American Giants, and then in a deal with the Negro Leagues was paid 5% of the annual gate. No other owner in any sport had a deal quite like that. And in 1920 alone, well over 400,000 fans attended Negro League games. He's getting 5% of the gate. Well, Rube ran the Negro Leagues like a tyrant. He really did. He controlled every aspect of black baseball operations, and even though the Negro Leagues were having tremendous success, there were some within his ranks that thought Rube had too much power.
Of course.
And this is the classic story of jealousy, greed, and envy, and why, again, I am pitching right now for there to be a dramatic TV series, because you can't make this stuff up. It's too good. And so the story has it that Rube was on league business in Indianapolis in 1925. And he's asleep in his hotel room. And he's exposed to a gas leak. A passerby smells the gas, kicks in, and rescues him. He's unconscious. When he finally wakes back up, he was never the same. Likely suffered brain damage while he was in that unconscious state. And it caused him to have fits of violent outrage, which ultimately forced his family to have to institutionalize him, where a few years later, he dies of a heart attack. Well, when Rube died, the fans of Chicago, who absolutely adored him, there was no middle ground. You either loved him or you hated him. And he had a long laundry list of those who couldn't stand his guts. But the fans of Chicago who absolutely adored him, they lined the streets for 3 consecutive days to pay their respect to their beloved Rube Foster. But you see, Nick, there is great belief that that gas leak wasn't accidental, that someone tried to take Rube out, and it was likely an inside job. The most brilliant mind in baseball history dies in an insane asylum. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. It's too good. There has to be a TV series done on the Negro Leagues, and of course, I'm pitching for me to be the executive producer.
Who else would do it?
But you can't make these stories up. There's a story that we share, and it's from a small newspaper clipping taken from the 1925 Wichita Beacon. And it tells the story of a baseball game between the Wichita Monrovians, which were a semi-pro all-black team, and Ku Klux Klan number 6. Now, I don't know how many installations of the Klan there was in Wichita at that time, but this was number 6. And they set this game up, was played at Island Park in Wichita in June of 1925. And the Monrovians win the game 10-8. And the Klan at that time was trying to convince the state of Kansas that they were a kinder, gentler Klan, because the state of Kansas was threatened to not renew their charter. And so they set up this game, and I mean, they pull out all stops. They have Catholic umpires umpiring the game. They play this game, and this game goes out without a hitch. The Monrovians win it 10-8. The state of Kansas still kicked the Klan out. And the Monrovians, I think, demonstrated that there was no superiority because they were white, and there was no inferiority because they were black. The Monrovians actually had a couple of guys who would ultimately make their way over to the Kansas City Monarchs, so this was a really good semi-pro team. But you can't make these kinds of stories up. No.
We need TV series.
We need a TV
series. Bob, thank you so much. I appreciate you spending some time with me here in the vault today. This was awesome. I would steal 4 more hours from you if I could. Just real quick here at the end, people want to go to the museum. Where's it at? How can they follow and find out more?
Yeah, no, and if you're hearing this before the month of February ends, please. It is absolutely free of charge the entire month of February, thanks to our friends over at the Kansas City Royals Foundation, who for the 5th consecutive year has made the museum, admission to the museum free for February to celebrate Black History Month. We are located at 1616 East 18th Street. Now, there's construction on 18th Street now as they're building a pedestrian mall, but there is still ample parking right behind the building on 17th Terrace, and you just enter in through the rear entry of the building. We're open in February. We're open 10 to 5 on Mondays now because typically we're closed on Mondays, but we wanted to create as much access to the museum as possible. But typically we're open 10 to 5 Tuesday through Saturday, noon to 5 on Sundays. And I suggest that people call for holiday hours because they sometimes change. But we hope people will come and see us. And you want to learn more, visit us online at www.nlbm.com to learn about our Pitch for the Future campaign to build a new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
That is fantastic. Bob, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for telling these stories.
Man, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you in the vault.
That'll wrap us up for this episode. We'll talk to everybody next time.